Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name. The program is Focal Point. If you'd like more information about Dave Bratt's campaign, you can go to his website, Dave Bratt for Congress, and Bratt is with one T. That's B-R-A-T, Dave Bratt, B-R-A-T, Dave Bratt for Congress.com. And I'm willing to bet that Eric Cantor thinks he's a bit of a brat right now because he is threatening the incumbency, one of the most powerful Republicans in the House of Representatives. That's Dave Bratt for Congress.com. And just a reminder again, I'm not going to take time to go through it because I talked about it yesterday, but I've got a column up at our website today about the DREAM Act. And my point here is that you have this humanitarian crisis. I mean, we have tens of thousands, it's going to be hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied minor children that are flooding the United States because they have heard about the DREAM Act. Who's behind the DREAM Act? Eric Cantor is behind the DREAM Act. You even have men like Governor Mike Huckabee and Governor Rick Perry, men who I have enormous affection for. They support the DREAM Act. Barack Obama supports the DREAM Act. The Republican leadership supports the DREAM Act. Marco Rubio supports the DREAM Act. And the problem with this is that it is a public policy that sounds good on the surface. It sounds compassionate. It sounds welcoming. Who could be against it? We ought to make it possible for these kids to have a guaranteed path to citizenship. They're here through no decision or fault of their own. But what we see is the unintended consequences of that, and we find out that in the end, this policy, which appears to be compassionate, is actually heartless. It is cruel because it exposes young children, vulnerable young children, to an unconscionable level of risk, of sex trafficking, of human trafficking, of violence, of extortion by Mexican officials as they make their way through the country of Mexico trying to get into the United States. So we have a humanitarian catastrophe. There's no other way to put it. Even President Obama, he created it. He created this catastrophe. Now he wants another $2 billion to try to clean up his own mess. This is such a crisis that they've even called FEMA in to handle it, apparently because it did such a great job with Katrina. But my point in the column is, look, the people who are behind the DREAM Act are responsible for this. They are to blame for what is happening to these children. They have created the circumstances. They're advocating a policy which has resulted in these children being exposed to this completely unacceptable level of risk and hardship. It's a disaster. It's a humanitarian disaster. It's a humanitarian catastrophe. And I believe those that support the DREAM Act are directly responsible for this. I don't care how nice their intentions were. I'm sure they were well-intentioned. They just wanted to do nice things for children, but they have created this unimaginable catastrophe, humanitarian catastrophe for young children. So that's up at rightlyconcerned.com, where you can find that column if you'd like to read a little bit more about it. I mentioned that President Obama was chewing gum at the D-Day commemoration today. It's hard for me to believe. That's just hard for me to believe, but there he was doing it right there in front of God and everybody. Now, got a lot I want to get to today, and I'm not even sure exactly where to start because I have so much information I want to give to you today. But let's go ahead and start with what's going on with. I'll tell you what I'm going to do to start with. We'll talk about the Bo Bergdahl, the update on that in the next segment. Since we were talking with Dave Bratt, and the number to call, by the way, if you want to jump in on the conversation, 888-589-8840, 888-589-8840. Free for all Friday. We'll talk about anything that's been in the news over the course of the past week. And as I mentioned in my conversation with Dave Bratt, we have a hotly contested primary in the state of Mississippi, one of the most significant ones in the country, because right now it represents the best chance for a Tea Party grassroots conservative candidate, State Senator Chris McDaniel, to unseat a powerful and entrenched incumbent, Senator Thad Cochran. And they're in a runoff. The runoff election is going to be on June 24. And we talked about this over the course of the week. I don't want to repeat a lot of this, but in situations like this, historically, the challenger is an overwhelming favorite to win the runoff. because if the incumbent cannot vanquish the challenger in the regular primary, it indicates a lack of enthusiasm, a lack of support. The challenger is the one that's the dark horse candidate. He's the one that's coming from behind. And Senator McDaniel actually outpolled Senator Cochran 49.6% to 48.9%, somewhere in that range. So he won the election from that standpoint. According to Mississippi rules, you got to get to 50% to win a primary outright. He didn't meet that threshold. So now the top two vote getters, that's Senator McDaniel and Senator Cochran, are going to go to a runoff on June 24. But typically, historically, this happened with Ted Cruz, unseating Lieutenant Governor David Dewhurst when he was running against him in 2012, lost to Dewhurst in the primary, but trounced him in the runoff because he had the energy, he had the passion, he had the grassroots behind him. And so a lot of observers are thinking that the same dynamic is going to play out here. You know, some of the establishment Republicans, like Karl Rove, have just pulled their money out of this race altogether. They basically have given up on Senator Cochran. They said, look, he can't win. We can read the tea leaves. We're not going to pour good money after bad. We're pulling out. No more money from us. Meanwhile, the conservative groups, the Club for Growth and the Tea Party Patriots and others that have been behind Chris McDaniel are continuing to support him, continuing to invest money and time and energy into his candidacy. So you'd have to say from an objective standpoint that Senator McDaniel would have to be considered the odds-on favorite to prevail on June 24. And I've got some stories here. Dick Lugar, who lost to an upstart back in 2012, he said, look, the thing that I have learned is that you got to slug it out. He said, if Senator Cochran had asked me, I would have said, look, you're going to have to devote a whole lot more energy to this campaign than you have. I've got a piece here, and I think Senator Cochran, he's 76, 78, somewhere in that neighborhood, and he just does not seem to have the vigor and the energy that is needed for a campaign like this. He has not debated Senator McDaniel. He's avoided every debate. He's never come on this program despite repeated invitations, won't have town hall events, dodges the mainstream media. And when he has interviewed with the mainstream media, he has raised concerns on the part of those that are interviewing him and watching him operate. Now, here's a piece from hotair.com. The GOP establishment wonders, is it time to abandon Thad Cochran? Talks here about the fact that Karl Rove's group, American Crossroads, is not going to be involved in this runoff whatsoever. Meanwhile, he says McDaniel's base is excited to knock off the incumbent, and outside groups like the Senate Conservatives Fund, that's Jim DeMint's the outfit that Jim DeMint started, are prepared to keep pumping in money to send a conservative to the Senate. Cochran's base, which includes a lot of casual voters who favor him for name recognition reasons alone, probably can't be bothered to trudge to the polls for the second time in 3 weeks. That's why insurgent candidates almost always pull the upset once they make it to the runoff. The only way to get Cochran voters back out there on June 24th is for his allies to spend boatloads more money tearing down McDaniel and promoting Cochran. And if it doesn't work and McDaniel wins the runoff anyway, then you've spent 3 weeks tearing your party's new nominee apart for no reason. And that apparently is some of the reasons why Karl Rove and others have simply abandoned the runoff. What spokesman Paul Lindsay said for American Crossroads, that's Karl Rove's group, we have completed our work on Senate primaries this cycle. Establishment groups met this week to decide how to play it. At a minimum, it sounds like they're going to stop trying to go hardcore after McDaniel. They spent a lot of time trying to tie him to that photograph, that scandal where Cochran's wife was photographed in her nursing home. McDaniel's campaign had nothing to do with that, and they're realizing, look, it's pointless to try to make hay out of that. Democrats now who voted in the Democratic primary, they cannot cross over and vote in this one. Mississippi rules prohibit them from doing that. So if they voted in the Democrat, because Senator Cochran was recruiting Democrats to vote for him in the primary, if they didn't do it, if they voted in the Democratic primary back on June 3rd, then they cannot vote for Senator Cochran on June 24th. Now, another piece here from Politico, another major website. Cochran backers face agonizing choice. The dilemma is agonizing on every level, forcing longtime Cochran allies who have already spent millions defending him to gauge how realistic the beloved senior senator's chances are to win a June 24th runoff. Now, this is interesting because Politico talks about the firepower that Senator Cochran had behind him. Cochran enjoyed the backing of a muscular array of corporate PACs and interest groups and received an extraordinary injection of late money from his Senate comrades. $27,000 from John McCain, Orrin Hatch, Rob Portman, John Boozman of Arkansas. The National Republican Senatorial Committee gave him $45,000 just as recently as May 20. But Politico raises the same question: how much more money are they willing to expend on this race? Karl Rove just among a number that have pulled out. Now, Ed Kilgore has got a piece talking about, let's see if I've got the right article here. Let's see. It is the piece on theatlantic.com. This is a writer that actually came to Mississippi and followed Thad Cochran around on the campaign trail. And here's what he said about, this is the Atlantic, which leans pretty far to the left. If Cochran is uniquely vulnerable, it is because he represents the last of a dying breed, the naive establishmentarian, a Republican who is unwilling or unable to learn the new folkways of a party that has shifted under his feet. And then he talked about how unsteady Senator Cochran seemed to be on the campaign trail. At a coffee shop here Monday morning, I watched as Cochran's staff moved him from place to place like a prop. Representative Greg Harper, a supporter, had to remind him to greet patrons, and he was mostly silent as he shook hands, standing still and listening as Harper made conversation. He was at a campaign appearance. On stage at the rally, Cochran read from paper notes. It was a stock speech of generic Republican lines. Cochran read slowly and deliberately, looking up from the podium every so often. The other politicians surrounding him on stage appeared nervous about whether he'd make it through the text, but he did not stumble. Focal Point AFR Talk.
My name's Garrett.